She barged onto my lawn in heels and a clipboard, barking about bylaws and threatening fines over my Saturday yard sale. What she didn't expect was that I'd read the HOA handbook better than she ever had, and I was ready to fight back. Like, subscribe, and share if you love watching bullies get served with their own rules. The sun was barely cresting over the rooftops when I unfolded the legs of the plastic table and set it up on the edge of my lawn. The morning smelled of cut grass and warm asphalt, and a soft breeze sent my old wind chimes into motion near the porch. I had been preparing for this yard sale all week. It wasn't just about getting rid of clutter. This was my clean break, a purge of everything I no longer needed from the last chapter of my life. The boxes held more than dishes and books. They held decisions I no longer regretted, and furniture that had outlasted the marriage it was bought for. I arranged the items by theme, some for home, some for kids, some for decor. The kids' corner had a pink tricycle I found in the garage, untouched for years. The tricycle wasn't mine, but the previous owner had left it behind along with a dozen puzzles and a water-damaged dollhouse. They were cleaned up now, gently priced, and placed beneath a handwritten sign that read, "Take home some joy." I thought it was a nice touch. I even had a little Bluetooth speaker playing Motown classics to give the morning a friendly rhythm. It started as a trickle. A woman walking her golden retriever paused, admired a vintage mirror, and left with 3 cookbooks. Then a young couple, just moved in from the East End, showed interest in my set of mason jars and a brass lamp. A teen from down the street bought a stack of CDs he probably couldn't even play, but he seemed charmed by their covers. People came and went, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was part of something. I was smiling, even laughing. Then she came. I saw her heels first, clicking too crisply against the driveway. She walked with sharp hips and a fixed smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Her hair was frosted blonde, her sunglasses oversized, her clipboard tight against her chest like a badge. Everyone in the neighborhood knew Kara not as her actual name, but as the symbol of everything oppressive about the HOA. She wore authority like perfume, and moved with the confidence of someone who had never been told no in a meaningful way. She didn't look at the items or the people browsing. She looked directly at me, like a heat-seeking missile. I didn't flinch. I'd half expected this moment, just not so soon. She crossed the grass without invitation, barely glancing down at the sale today signs I'd secured with little flags. She stopped in front of the table, lips pursed. "Do you have a permit for this?" she asked, tone flat but accusatory. I blinked. "A permit? This is a yard sale." She nodded once, like she already knew I'd say that. She adjusted her sunglasses with 2 fingers, then looked down at the clipboard. Per Article 7, Section 12 of the Oak Heights Community Handbook, all public sales, including but not limited to yard, garage, and estate sales, must be submitted to the HOA at least 10 business days in advance and approved by board consensus. I let that sink in for half a second before responding. I checked the handbook. It says sales can be held twice a year per household. It doesn't say anything about advance notice or board consensus. She smiled, the way someone smiles when they think they've already won. "That's in the 2021 addendum. You're reading the outdated version." "I downloaded it last week," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "From the official HOA website." "Well," she said, voice clipped, "then clearly we need to update our site. But that doesn't exempt you. This is a violation. You'll be receiving a formal notice." I stepped around the table, casually, not aggressive. "I've seen yard sales on this street every year. I've never once seen someone get fined for it." "That's because they filed the correct paperwork," she said, her fingers tightening on the clipboard. "Unlike you." Behind her, a few neighbors had paused, sensing the tension. One of them was the teen who'd just bought the CD stack. He lingered by the sidewalk, earbuds out, watching. I wasn't about to let her put on a show at my expense. "I'm just trying to sell some old things," I said calmly. "Nothing is blocking the sidewalk. I'm not blasting music. I'm not disturbing anyone." "You're disturbing me," she said, stepping closer. "This is a neighborhood of order. People move here for peace and standards. If you want chaos and clutter, there are plenty of other neighborhoods that welcome that." There it was, the quiet venom behind her pearls. She wasn't just concerned about protocol. She was implying something else. Something about who belonged and who didn't. I felt my jaw tighten. I pay my dues like everyone else, I said louder now. And there's no clause in the bylaws that gives you the right to enforce them like a one-woman police force. Karen reached for a brochure tucked in the back of her clipboard and slapped it onto my table. Expect your fine by Monday, and if I see another unauthorized sale sign, that's an additional citation. Have a nice day. With that, she turned on her heel and walked off, her heels loud again, like punctuation marks. I stared at the paper she left. It wasn't even official. It was a photocopy of some rule she had typed up herself, highlighted with pink marker like a school assignment. The breeze caught one corner and lifted it slightly. I didn't bother to hold it down. Around me, the yard sale continued, but the mood had changed. People were quieter, less certain. A few walked off with awkward glances. Even the music sounded faint now, like it didn't have permission to play. I could have packed it all up. I could have taken the easy road, cancelled the sale, and apologized to the clipboard queen. But as I stood there, watching her walk away like she owned the street, I realized something. She wasn't just enforcing a rule, she was counting on me to shrink. That was her mistake, because I don't shrink, not anymore. The notice came the very next day, folded crisply and tucked into my mailbox like it belonged there. A pale green envelope with the Oak Heights HOA logo stamped in the upper left corner, as if that emblem somehow made it official and important. I carried it into the house, still warm from the sun, and laid it flat on the kitchen table. I didn't open it right away. Instead, I made coffee, fed the cat, stood by the window for a while. But there it sat, humming with quiet menace, until I couldn't ignore it anymore. Inside was a single sheet of paper, printed in all caps except for my name. It cited unauthorized commercial activity and gave a fine of $500 due within 15 days. No further explanation. No photographic evidence. Just a terse paragraph claiming I had violated Article 7, Section 12, followed by a line that read, "Additional action may be taken for repeat offenses." At the bottom was Karen's signature in thick blue ink, looping and proud. I stared at the page for a while, not angry yet, just stunned. I hadn't expected her to follow through so quickly or so fiercely. I figured the clipboard was more bark than bite, a scare tactic. But here it was, her bark made paper, trying to become law. I folded the sheet and placed it gently on the counter. Then I took a deep breath and pulled the HOA handbook from the drawer. I had downloaded the full version last week, the one available to every resident on the community website. It was 73 pages long, complete with outdated clipart and confusing language. I scrolled to Article 7, Section 12, the original version. It said that individual residents were permitted up to 2 sales per year, as long as they did not obstruct public walkways or create undue noise. No language about advance approval, no mention of board votes, no emergency clauses, nothing that justified what she had sent me. That was when the anger started to bloom. Not the white-hot kind that makes you scream or throw things, but a cooler, steelier kind. The kind that makes you sit up straighter. The kind that makes you take notes. I began to think back on the stories I'd heard from neighbors. Mrs. Talbot across the street had once been fined for putting up her Christmas lights, too early, though there was no such rule on record. The Hendersons down the block were forced to repaint their door a dull beige after Karen personally deemed the cranberry color too loud. The Martins, a young black couple who had just moved in 6 months ago, told me they had received 3 different violations in their first month own for a garden gnome, another for a child's toy left on the lawn, and a third for parking slightly off-center in their own driveway. At the time, I hadn't paid much attention. I'd nodded sympathetically but figured they were exaggerating. But now, with my own fine in hand, I saw it differently. Karen wasn't just some stickler for rules. She was using the handbook like a weapon, wielding it however she pleased. Selective enforcement, vague threats, random citations all backed by the illusion of structure and the fear of consequence. I decided I needed to document everything. I pulled out a yellow legal pad and started writing. Time, date, event, her exact words, the contents of the notice. I took pictures of the yard sale setup, even though it had already ended, to show that nothing had obstructed sidewalks and no loud music had been playing. I printed a copy of the HOA handbook from the website and highlighted the relevant sections. Then I put all of it in a manila folder labeled Karen. Later that afternoon I went for a walk, not because I needed fresh air, but because I wanted to talk. I stopped by the house 2 doors down, where Mrs. Talbot was pruning her bushes. She was in her 60s, thin and meticulous, with garden gloves that matched her watering can. When I mentioned the fine, her eyes widened but her mouth formed a thin, unsurprised line. She took off one glove and motioned me closer. She led me into her kitchen and pulled out her own collection of notices, neatly filed in a drawer labeled HOA nonsense. There were 6, all of them minor infractions, all of them signed by Karen. She showed me one that said improper seasonal decor for a scarecrow she had placed on her lawn in October. Another cited overwatering her garden during an unseasonably dry week. She said she had tried to appeal once but was told the appeal process was closed due to a lack of quorum. The next house was the Martins. They were hesitant at first, but when I told them what happened, they invited me in. Their living room was warm and filled with toys. Their daughter ran circles around the coffee table while her parents spoke in low, careful voices. They told me that Karen had visited them within a week of moving in. No welcome, no baked goods. Just a printed copy of the rules and a verbal warning about keeping up appearances. They said she watched their house, walked by with her dog twice a day, sometimes even took pictures. Each story was worse than the last, and they all had the same thread. None of the infractions were clear. None of the rules were cited properly. All were signed by Karen. She had turned the HOA into her personal fiefdom and had been ruling by intimidation and confusion. By the time I returned home, the folder labeled Karen had doubled in size. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about all of us. I sat at my kitchen table again, opened my laptop, and searched for the HOA's internal structure. I found a basic org chart listing Karen as board president. 2 other board members were listed with email addresses, though I had never heard their names spoken at any meeting or seen them around the neighborhood. That was the next step. I composed a polite but direct email to both of them, outlining my concern. I attached the fine, the handbook, and my photographic evidence. I asked for clarification and a copy of the 2021 addendum Karen had referenced. I hit send and waited. The replies came 2 days later. One was an out-of-office message. The other was short and evasive, saying that any updates to community policy are handled internally and do not require full distribution. That was the moment I realized something else. Karen wasn't just exploiting the system. She was the system, and she wasn't operating alone. Still, I didn't panic. I printed everything. I copied the emails, the notices, even screenshots of the HOA website. I filed it all in the folder, which now sat thick and defiant on my kitchen counter. I looked at it and felt something shift inside me, something long buried under politeness and accommodation. Karen thought she could silence me with a fine. What she didn't know was that I had nothing left to lose. And people with nothing to lose make terrible targets. They also make the best fighters. By the end of the week, my living room resembled something between a command center and a detective's lair. The manila folder labeled Karen had grown into a full accordion file. I had taped pages of the HOA handbook to the wall, marked with sticky notes in neon colors. Every table surface was littered with printed emails, old newsletters, and neighborhood flyers dating back 3 years. I even had a legal pad devoted entirely to timestamps and quotes from the neighbors I'd spoken with, each of them offering small pieces of the same larger truth. This wasn't a one-time power grab. Karen had turned the Oak Heights HOA into her own gated kingdom, and I wasn't the first to be punished for stepping out of line. On Saturday morning, I poured a cup of coffee and sat down with the binder again. It was strange how comforting the ritual had become. There was something about sifting through paper and facts that made the chaos feel manageable. I had never been one to seek conflict, but I wasn't new to it either. Life has a way of teaching you how to handle people like Karen. The ones who think rules are meant to control, not to protect. The ones who build walls and tell themselves they are gates. After an hour of reading, I noticed something strange. In the 2021 HOA board meeting minutes, there was a single line referencing a vote to approve adjustments to Article 7, but no details were listed. No outline of changes, No vote breakdown, no ratified text, just a vague note about a discussion and an action taken. That alone wouldn't be suspicious, but when I cross-referenced the newsletter from the following month, there was no mention of any bylaw change, nothing sent to the residents, nothing posted on the bulletin boards at the community centre. It was as if the amendment existed only in the margins, whispered about but never proven. I highlighted the line in yellow and circled it. I decided I needed access to the original documents, not just the versions publicly shared online. That meant going to the HOA office. I had driven past it dozens of times but never had reason to stop. It was a squat brick building tucked behind the community pool, with tinted windows and a single flagpole that never seemed to fly anything. I walked in on a Tuesday afternoon, wearing my most neutral smile and a pair of oversized sunglasses that made me feel braver than I was. The front desk was manned by a young woman with glossy hair and a nameplate that read, Emily. She looked up from her computer when I entered, her expression somewhere between polite and bored. Hi, I said. I'm a resident. I was hoping to review the official HOA bylaws and any addendums, especially the 2021 update to Article 7. Emily blinked slowly. Do you have an appointment? No, but I thought I'd ask. I just received a citation that references an update I can't find in the publicly available documents. I'd like to see the record. She hesitated, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. We don't usually give out internal board minutes without a formal request. I'm not asking for confidential deliberations, just the final approved language and proof of the vote. She seemed unsure. Let me check with Mrs. Caldwell. The name landed like a rock in the room. Karen. I waited as Emily picked up the phone and turned slightly away, murmuring into the receiver. I could only hear fragments. Asking about Article 7, wants access, said it's not online. A pause. Then Emily stiffened and turned back to me with a rehearsed smile. I'm sorry, but Mrs. Caldwell said those documents aren't available to the public. You're welcome to submit a written inquiry. I thanked her, turned around, and walked out slowly, careful not to slam the door. As soon as I reached the sidewalk, I exhaled. She was hiding something. There was no other reason to lock up information that was supposed to guide the very residents it governed. If the amendment were real and properly approved, it would have been printed, distributed, and archived. I spent the rest of the afternoon talking to neighbors who had been here longer than I had. One by one, they confirmed the same thing. No one had received notice of a bylaw change in 2021. No one remembered a vote being called. In fact, most said they hadn't seen Karen's fellow board members in over a year. One woman, Ruth, told me she had seen a board meeting posted once but arrived to find the door locked and the lights off. She laughed bitterly as she recalled it, shaking her head and offering me a glass of lemonade like we were trading war stories. That night, I started to catalogue the violations. Not mine, but everyone else's. I made a spreadsheet, listing each neighbour, the date of their citation, the rule cited, and the signature at the bottom. In over 20 examples, only 3 rules were repeated. The rest were obscure or inconsistently applied. Even worse, every single citation had Karen's signature. Not once had another board member issued a notice. Not once had a committee signed off on an appeal. The HOA, in practice, was a one-woman operation. I knew I couldn't go after her with anger alone. I needed leverage, something undeniable, something clean. I decided to record everything from that point forward. Every conversation, every visit. I installed a doorbell camera. I encouraged others to do the same. We created a private message group. Just a few of us at first, but it grew. People who had once been afraid to speak started sharing stories. Photos of ridiculous violations, screenshots of Karen's passive-aggressive emails, a blurry image of her dog peeing on someone's hydrangeas, followed by a warning about unsanitary lawn conditions. Through it all, I stayed quiet on the surface. I smiled at Karen when she passed me on the street. I waved from my porch. I let her think I had accepted the fine and moved on. But every day, I was building something beneath the calm exterior. A timeline, a paper trail, a case. I began to feel something unfamiliar, a quiet confidence. I didn't need to shout to be heard. I didn't need to match her aggression with fire. I just needed truth, patience, and precision. Karen had built a fortress on shaky ground. All I had to do was find the right stone to pull, and the whole thing would come down. Not with a bang, but with a satisfying silence. I looked over at the binder, now fat with evidence and notes. I smiled. The game had started. She thought I was just another rule breaker. She didn't know I was preparing to become her reckoning. It was a warm Sunday morning when I first realized I wasn't alone in this fight. The sun was just beginning to stretch across the neighborhood rooftops, and a few kids were out on their bikes, swerving between driveways like they owned the pavement. I was watering the front shrubs, still pretending that everything was fine on the outside, but my mind was crowded with pages of bylaws and email threads. I had spent the better part of 2 weeks building a record, but it still felt like a solo mission. I needed someone else to say out loud what I already knew. That someone turned out to be Mr. Keating, who lived 3 houses down. He was retired, somewhere in his late 60s, and always wore socks with his sandals no matter the weather. I saw him walking his dog, a barrel-chested beagle with a grumpy face, and decided to take a chance. I stepped out onto the sidewalk, waved him down, and asked if he had a minute to chat. He looked wary at first, like most people do when they think you're about to try and sell them something. But when I mentioned Karen's name and the fine she gave me, his eyebrows lifted like I'd just said a forbidden word. He glanced around before speaking, then leaned in slightly as if the hydrangeas might be listening. "She fined me $200 last year," he said. "Said my fence was a 1/4 inch too tall. Had to cut the top slats myself with a handsaw. I've lived here 24 years. No one ever said a word until she showed up with that clipboard." I told him what I'd found so far: the missing vote records, the fake bylaw amendment, the pattern of fines signed only by her. As I spoke, his expression shifted from disbelief to something harder and more focused. When I finished, he looked me dead in the eye and said, "You need to talk to Tamika." I didn't know Tamika well. I had seen her a few times at the mailbox cluster, a single mother with 2 boys always in soccer gear. She lived on the west end of the neighborhood, near the back entrance that Karen rarely patrolled. Mr. Cordev. Keating offered to walk me over, and I followed, notebook tucked under my arm, unsure what I was walking into. Tamika greeted us on the porch, wearing jeans and a paint-splattered t-shirt. She looked tired in the way that working mothers do, but when she heard why I was there, her posture straightened and her eyes sharpened. She invited us in, and we sat at her kitchen table, where a half-finished science project rested next to a plate of apple slices. "She made me remove my wind chimes," Tamika said without preamble. "Claimed they violated the noise ordinance. They were decorative, never rang louder than a whisper. But she came by, pointed to some made-up clause, and gave me 72 hours to take them down or face a daily fine." She reached into a drawer and pulled out a thick envelope. Inside were printouts of her own citations, each one pettier than the last. Lawn too long by 1/2 inch. Basketball hoop left up overnight. Too many people at her son's birthday party, which she was told violated the community conduct expectations. Every one of them signed by Karen. None of them supported by any real evidence. We sat there for over an hour, trading stories and shaking our heads. Tamika had already started collecting documents, though she admitted she hadn't known what to do with them until now. I asked if she'd be willing to join forces. Her answer was immediate. "You're damn right I will," she said. "I've been waiting for someone to push back." Within days, the group started to grow. Mr. Keating brought in a couple who had been cited for putting solar lights along their driveway. Tamika recruited 2 other single parents who had dealt with similar nonsense. I reached out to the Hendersons, the Martins, and even Ruth with her overwatered hydrangeas. Each one had their own tale of petty harassment. Some had tried to fight it. Most had simply paid the fines and kept their heads down. But when I laid out everything I had uncovered, when I showed them how it wasn't just about rules, but about control, they began to lean forward. We formed a group chat. We gave ourselves a name as a joke, calling it the Neighborhood Watchdogs. It was light-hearted at first, a way to laugh at the absurdity of it all. But very quickly, it became something more. We started comparing violation notices, aligning dates and codes. Patterns emerged. Karen rarely targeted the same person twice in the same month. She spread the fines around just enough to avoid attention, but it was always her, always acting alone, always without oversight. One of the watchdogs, a woman named Priya, was a paralegal who had just moved in 6 months ago. She offered to help organize our evidence. With her guidance, we began to format everything like a legal case. Each violation had its own folder. Each conversation with Karen was transcribed or summarized. Photos were labeled. Email chains were printed. It was no longer just a collection of complaints. It was a dossier. Meanwhile, Karen must have sensed something was shifting. She started issuing new rules almost weekly, each one more ridiculous than the last. No yard signs over 6 inches tall. No porch furniture not approved by the board. No gatherings of more than 6 people without a permit. She sent out these updates via poorly formatted PDFs attached to mass emails that didn't allow replies. They weren't official votes. There were no board meeting notices. She was ruling by decree. It was Tamika who suggested we push back in public. "Let's call a town hall," she said. "Let's stop hiding in our kitchens and show her we're done playing quiet." We printed flyers, posted them near the mailbox clusters, and slid them under doors. The message was simple. "Let's talk. Thursday at 7 p.m. Community Center. Enough is enough." We weren't sure how many people would come, but when Thursday arrived, the small hall was packed. Folding chairs were dragged in from every corner. People lined the back walls, arms crossed, faces hard. Karen showed up 15 minutes late, wearing a pressed blazer and heels that clicked across the tile floor. She looked around at the room, clearly surprised by the turnout. She walked to the front, clipboard in hand, and asked who had authorized the gathering. I stood. So did Tamika. Then Priya. Then Mr. Keating. The rest of the room followed, one by one, until she was the only one still sitting. She opened her mouth to speak, but I beat her to it. I held up a printout of the HOA bylaws. I turned to the page with Article 7, Section 12. I read it aloud. Then I asked, in a calm voice, for her to point to the 2021 amendment. She didn't have it. She claimed it was in a file. We asked for the vote records. She said they were confidential. The room began to murmur. People demanded to see proof. Karen tried to raise her voice, but it was too late. The room no longer belonged to her. That night, something shifted permanently. The power Karen had built over years of intimidation was unraveling, and for the first time, she realized that the neighborhood wasn't afraid anymore. We hadn't just built a resistance. We had become a force, and we weren't backing down. The board meeting that followed wasn't supposed to be dramatic. Karen had made sure of that. The official notice she sent out was vague and tucked between updates about new trash bin colors and an upcoming spring festival. It mentioned routine governance updates, nothing more. But everyone in the neighborhood knew exactly what it was. The flyers we'd passed out after the town hall had circulated faster than we expected. They were passed from neighbor to neighbor, whispered about during dog walks and poolside conversations. By the time the day arrived, the community center looked like it was hosting a wedding, not a procedural meeting. Folding chairs were arranged in neat rows, but they filled quickly, and more had to be brought in. People stood shoulder to shoulder near the back doors. A few even sat on the floor near the walls, some holding copies of their own violation notices, others just curious to see if the rumors were true. If Karen had expected a quiet meeting with bored homeowners nodding through financial reports, she was in for a surprise. I sat in the second row with Tamika and Priya. Mr. Keating sat beside them, holding a small spiral notebook like it was a shield. I could feel the nervous energy buzzing all around us, the kind that precedes a storm. Karen arrived exactly at 7, flanked by 2 board members I had never seen before. One was a pale, thin man with a stooped posture who looked uncomfortable even being there. The other was a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes who barely made eye contact with anyone. Karen walked to the front of the room and stood behind the podium like a judge about to deliver a sentence. She cleared her throat and welcomed everyone with a tight smile. Her voice was smooth, measured, and practiced. She spoke about the importance of community standards and how the HOA existed to protect property values and quality of life. She used words like stability and tradition, trying to weave a comforting tone over the crowd. But it wasn't working. People weren't nodding. They were waiting. When she opened the floor for questions, Tamika was the first to stand. She didn't raise her voice. She simply asked Karen when the board had voted to amend Article 7 of the handbook. Karen blinked once, then offered a reply that said very little. She mentioned a board meeting in 2021, a unanimous vote, and a procedural update that had not yet been reflected on the website due to staffing delays. Her tone was firm, but the room didn't relax. Priya stood next. She asked to see the meeting minutes from that vote. Karen said they were not available to the public, but could be reviewed through a written request and a formal approval process. Priya pressed further, pointing out that homeowners were entitled to review board decisions that directly affected their rights and responsibilities. Karen interrupted her, claiming it was inappropriate to challenge board authority in a public setting. A few people in the audience groaned. Then Mr. Keating stood and asked a question no one expected. He asked how much of the HOA's collected fine money had gone toward the decorative stone sign installed at the front gate last year. Karen looked stunned. She said the board had approved that expense as part of the landscaping budget. Mr. Keating replied calmly that he had requested the budget from the previous year, and it showed no such approval. A murmur spread across the room. I stood next. I didn't ask a question. I read aloud the line from the handbook stating that residents were entitled to review financial records upon reasonable request. Then I held up a copy of my fine and explained how it referenced a bylaw change that had never been distributed. I explained how I had been denied access to official documents. I listed the number of citations I had reviewed, all signed by Karen and none reviewed by the full board. I finished by saying that the HOA was no longer operating as a democratic institution, but as a private monarchy. The silence that followed was heavy. Karen gripped the edges of the podium. She said the board had done everything by the book. She said the citations were based on real violations and that order was necessary for peace. She said homeowners had no right to challenge what had already been decided. That was the moment the lawyer stood up. His name was James Lynn. He lived on the edge of the neighborhood and had never said much in the past, but tonight he had come wearing a grey blazer and carrying a folder. He introduced himself briefly and then began to speak about fiduciary duty. He said the HOA was a legal entity bound to transparency, fairness, and procedural consistency. He quoted a few statutes. Then he turned to Karen and asked whether she could provide, right now, a signed document showing board approval for the 2021 amendment. Karen hesitated. She glanced at her clipboard, flipped a page, then shook her head. She said it wasn't with her. James nodded. Then he said, clearly and calmly, that without such proof, any fines issued based on that amendment could be considered invalid. And if those fines were issued knowingly, they could constitute a form of harassment under state law. The room was no longer quiet. People began whispering, nodding, muttering questions to each other. One woman held up her phone, recording the whole exchange. Karen raised her voice and said that this was getting out of hand, that the meeting was no longer productive. She asked the crowd to return to order, but no one moved. Then the stooped man beside her spoke up. He looked nervous, but his voice was clear. He said he had never voted on any bylaw amendment. He said he hadn't even been invited to a board meeting in over a year. The sharp-eyed woman beside him followed, saying she had only signed on to help with social events and had never seen a budget or a vote log. Karen's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The illusion shattered. The audience began to stir. People stood. Some clapped. Others called for Karen's resignation. She tried to gavel the meeting closed, but no one listened. Voices rose, not in chaos but in unity. Someone shouted that they wanted a new vote, a new board. Someone else asked for a financial audit. Another person asked where the landscaping company had come from and how much they were paid. Karen backed away from the podium. Her clipboard hung at her side like a broken sword. She tried to speak again, but the crowd had moved past her. They were no longer asking permission. Outside, the night was cool and clear. I walked to my car with Tamika and Priya, hearts pounding. It wasn't over. Not yet. But for the first time, Karen hadn't won the room. And that was the beginning of the end. The morning after the meeting, I woke up with a strange mix of emotions. Part of me felt light, almost giddy, like we had finally pulled back the curtain on a long-running magic trick and shown the wires. But another part of me, the one that lived closer to caution, knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Karen wouldn't slink away quietly. She had held on to power for too long, built too much of her identity around that clipboard and the illusion of control. People like her did not back down easily. They looked for new ways to strike back. The signs came quickly. 3 of us in the watchdogs received fresh citations in the mail. Mine accused me of public misconduct during official community proceedings. A phrase so vague it might as well have been copied from a fortune cookie. Tamika got fined for excessive outdoor lighting, even though her front porch bulb had gone out and she hadn't replaced it yet. Mr. Keating received notice that his mailbox was non-compliant, despite the fact it had been there for over 20 years and matched every other one on the block. Karen was retaliating. She was using the system we had challenged to punish us all over again, hoping that if she made it painful enough, we'd stop. But that tactic only confirmed what we already knew. This wasn't about rules or bylaws. This was about keeping people quiet. And now that we had found our voice, there was no turning back. That afternoon I drove downtown to meet with James Lynn, the lawyer who had spoken up during the meeting. He worked in a modest office above a bakery that always smelled like cinnamon and warm sugar. I found him sitting behind a neat desk, flipping through a binder labeled Oak Heights HOA. When I entered, he stood and shook my hand with the calm assurance of someone used to dealing with conflict. He offered me coffee and gestured for me to sit. I pulled out my own folder, stuffed now with printouts, violation copies, and a full timeline of everything that had happened since the yard sale. James skimmed through the documents silently, occasionally nodding or highlighting a line with a neon pen. When he finished, he closed the folder and leaned back. "You've got a strong case," he said. "Maybe stronger than you think." I asked what kind of legal action we could take. He said we had several options. We could file a formal complaint with the state HOA regulatory board, which would investigate potential abuses of power. We could also pursue civil litigation against the HOA for unlawful fines, failure to provide documentation, and procedural misconduct. And depending on the outcome of discovery, we might even uncover financial mismanagement that could lead to restitution for improperly collected fees. It felt overwhelming, but not in a bad way. For weeks, I had been gathering information, not knowing what exactly I would do with it. Now I had a path, a real one. I asked James what the next step was. He told me we needed to send a demand letter, not to Karen, but to the HOA as an entity. It would outline our grievances, request immediate suspension of enforcement activities, and demand access to the full board voting records. If they refused, we would file suit. We drafted the letter together. He was precise, every word chosen to land with weight. When it was done, he printed 3 copies. I signed all of them. He would send one to the HOA's official address, one to Karen's home, and one to the regulatory board. He slid the originals into a stiff white envelope and sealed them with quiet finality. By the time I left his office, the sun had started to sink behind the downtown buildings, casting long shadows across the sidewalks. I sat in my car for a few minutes, letting it all settle. This was real now. We weren't just whispering at mailboxes anymore. We were holding them accountable. I sent a message to the watchdogs, letting them know what had been filed. The responses came in fast. Tamika sent a string of celebration emojis. Mr. Keating replied with a simple, "Finally." Priya said she had just found another neighbor with a file of violations and would bring it over that night. 2 days later, the letter was received. I knew because Karen showed up at my house. She didn't knock right away. She stood on the sidewalk for a few moments, like she wasn't sure what she was doing. She wore her usual pressed blouse and dark pants, but something in her posture was different. She looked tired. When she finally walked up the driveway, I opened the door before she could knock. "I assume you've seen the letter," I said. She nodded once. Her lips were pressed together like she was chewing something bitter. For a moment, we just stood there, no one saying anything. "You think you've won?" she finally said. "No," I answered. "I think it's about time someone reminded you that this neighborhood doesn't belong to you." Her eyes narrowed, but she didn't argue. She asked if I would consider withdrawing the complaint, said it would be better for everyone if we kept things inside the community. I almost laughed. That was the same tone she had used when handing me that first fine. As if this were all just a misunderstanding, a small matter among neighbors. But it wasn't small. Not to the people she had harassed. Not to the families who had paid fines they couldn't afford. Not to the new residents she had intimidated with her quiet cruelty. I told her no. She left without another word. That night, we held another meeting, this time in Tamika's backyard. It was too warm to be indoors, and the atmosphere was different now. Less fear, more momentum. James attended and answered questions about what to expect. He explained how discovery would work, how subpoenas could bring out records the HOA had tried to bury. He told us what documentation we should be ready to provide. More people joined the group. A young woman who had just moved in the month before, an elderly couple who had been afraid to speak until now. Every one of them had a story. Every one of them had a reason to be there. When the meeting ended, we didn't disperse right away. We stayed and talked, sharing food and laughter under the string lights Tamika had hung from the trees. It felt like a real community for the first time. No rules taped to doors, no warnings tucked into mailboxes. Just people reclaiming something they had almost forgotten they deserved. I went home that night exhausted, but in a good way. I opened my laptop, created a new folder titled HOA Lawsuit, and began organizing everything we had into clean labeled subfolders. It wasn't glamorous work. It didn't feel heroic, but I knew it mattered. We weren't just defending our rights anymore. We were building something stronger than Karen's fear. We were building a case. We were building trust. And we were ready for the fight ahead. The room where the deposition took place was cold and sterile, with fluorescent lighting that made everyone's skin look washed out. A long table ran down the center, flanked by stiff-backed chairs that looked more like props than furniture meant for comfort. At one end sat James Lynn, his papers neatly arranged in front of him, and a recorder placed between him and the witness seat. I sat beside him, silent but attentive. Across the table, Karen waited with her own attorney, a man in a rumpled grey suit who looked like he had read the case notes in the elevator on the way up. Karen wore her usual armor, a buttoned blazer in navy, a strand of pearls that caught the light every time she turned her head, and a quiet confidence that had once carried her through meetings with unchecked authority. But today, her expression betrayed a tightness around the eyes, a measured control that wasn't quite as firm as usual. She sat with her back straight, her chin high, but her fingers tapped the side of her chair, betraying the rhythm of nerves she couldn't hide. The deposition began with formality. James asked for her full name, her position within the Oak Heights HOA, the length of her service. She answered in clipped, clear sentences, trying to maintain an air of indifference. But as James moved through the timeline, bringing up specific fines issued to specific residents, her answers became shorter and her pauses longer. For each violation, he asked for evidence. For each amendment, he asked for proof of board votes, documentation, or distribution notices. She deflected where she could, but James was methodical. He never raised his voice, never rushed. He just kept moving, one piece of paper after another, like slowly pulling threads from a tightly woven sweater. About an hour in, he brought out the spreadsheet we had compiled. It listed every violation issued under her signature for the past 18 months. Beside each name was the date, the code cited, and whether the board had been notified or involved in the decision. There were dozens of rows, and in more than 80% of the cases, there was no accompanying record of a board vote or internal review. James asked her directly whether the board had reviewed any of these citations. Karen hesitated for the first time. "I don't recall," she said. James looked up from his notes. "You don't recall if the board reviewed over 40 separate citations?" "They were minor issues," she replied. "Routine. I handled them because they didn't require full discussion." "So you issued fines without a formal vote or record?" "I followed community standards," she said. "The rules are clear." "But the process is not," James replied, and his voice remained level. "And you are not authorized to act as the sole decision-maker. Were you aware that according to your own HOA bylaws, all fines must be reviewed and approved by the board before being issued?" Karen's mouth opened slightly. Her lawyer leaned in and placed a hand on her arm. "We'll need a moment," he said. They stepped outside, and I sat back, letting the silence settle. I looked at James, who didn't say anything, just kept flipping through the next batch of documents. When Karen and her lawyer returned, her tone had changed. She was still polite, still measured, but there was a new note in her voice, less certainty, more caution. James moved on to the finances. He brought up the stone sign at the front of the neighborhood, the one Mr. Keating had mentioned. According to the public budget, the expense had not been approved in a formal meeting, yet invoices had been paid to a landscaping company that no one had ever heard of. James asked who selected that vendor. Karen looked down at her lap. I did, she said finally. Were bids collected? No. Was the board consulted? They trusted my judgment. Was the company affiliated with you or anyone you know? Karen hesitated again. My cousin runs it, she admitted. James let the silence hang in the air. That's a violation of disclosure rules, he said gently. Karen didn't respond. After that, it unraveled quickly. James asked about the 2021 bylaw amendment. Karen said it had been voted on. When pressed for meeting minutes, she admitted there were none. When asked how the amendment had been distributed to homeowners, she said it had been implied through community newsletters. James pointed out that no such amendment had ever been published or recorded officially. She countered that it was common knowledge. He replied that legality does not depend on assumption. It depends on documentation. Her answers thinned. She became more defensive, and her lawyer started objecting more frequently. But every objection just made the silence afterward more pronounced. Every gap in her memory made the file in front of James look more solid. When the deposition ended, Karen left the room without looking at me. Her lawyer gathered his things quickly and followed. James and I remained in our seats, surrounded by the quiet shuffle of paper and the low hum of the fluorescent lights. Well, James said, glancing at his notes. She gave us more than enough. He began packing up his things. I asked him if he thought it would be enough to win. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he paused and gave me a small, knowing smile. She just admitted to bypassing board procedure, awarding a contract to a family member, and enforcing a bylaw that doesn't legally exist. That's more than enough to move forward. On the drive home, I thought about everything that had happened since the yard sale. I had started out just trying to sell some old things on a sunny Saturday morning. I had never intended to dig into financial misconduct or hold anyone legally accountable, but that's how these things often begin, with one person saying no, with one person refusing to be quiet. Karen had built a wall around herself using fear and paperwork, hoping no one would notice the cracks. But now, the cracks were showing, and behind them was something weak, something real, something unraveling. That evening, I met with Tamika and Priya. We gathered on my back porch, lit a few candles, and went over the deposition highlights. When I told them about the landscaping contract, Tamika nearly spilled her drink. Priya laughed and shook her head, amazed. Mr. Keating showed up with a thermos of tea and a manila envelope full of neighborhood flyers from the past 2 years, which we scanned for further inconsistencies. We stayed out there until after midnight, energized by the momentum, fueled by something stronger than frustration. We were building a case, yes. But more than that, we were reclaiming something that had been quietly taken. By the time I went to bed, the house was dark and still. I stood by the window for a while, looking out at the street, at the porch lights and trimmed lawns and familiar sidewalks. It had never looked more like home. And this time, it was ours. The courtroom was quiet, even before the judge entered. There were no gavel bangs or dramatic gasps, just the shuffle of papers, the low murmur of conversation between attorneys, and the soft creak of the wooden benches beneath nervous bodies. I sat on the left side, dressed in a charcoal blazer and black slacks, my hair pulled back neatly. Beside me, James Lynn adjusted his tie with one hand and opened his briefcase with the other. He looked calm, almost serene, but I could see the calculation in his eyes. He wasn't underestimating this. Karen sat across the aisle, her posture as rigid as ever. Her lawyer leaned close, whispering something as she nodded slightly, her hands folded neatly on the table. She wore grey this time instead of navy, and her pearl necklace had been replaced with something more subtle. She didn't look over at me. She hadn't, since the deposition. The judge entered, and everyone stood. He was an older man with silver hair and deep lines around his eyes, the kind that suggested he had seen every kind of case come through his courtroom. He greeted us politely and asked both sides if we were ready to proceed. When everyone affirmed, he gestured for the plaintiff's side to begin. James stood slowly and began with the basics. He laid out our case in plain language, not for the judge, but for the record. He explained how I had received a fine for an alleged violation based on a bylaw amendment that did not exist in any official record. He described the failure of the HOA to produce evidence of the vote, the missing meeting minutes, and the lack of notification to residents. He brought up the citations against other homeowners, each one issued without board approval, each one signed only by Karen. Then he moved to the landscaping contract, laying out the conflict of interest like a clean puzzle. He didn't rely on theatrics. He didn't raise his voice or point fingers. He just spoke clearly, methodically, the same way he had during the deposition. When he finished, he returned to his seat and handed the rest to the facts already entered into evidence. Karen's lawyer stood next. His approach was different. He began by stating that the HOA had acted within its authority to enforce community standards. He acknowledged that some procedures had not been followed, to the letter, but argued that no harm had been done. He said the board trusted Karen, and her actions were consistent with her responsibilities. He downplayed the financial connection to the landscaping company and called it a minor oversight. He said the lawsuit was an overreaction to a misunderstanding. The judge nodded throughout, asking a few clarifying questions, but never interrupting. When it came time to call witnesses, James motioned for me to take the stand. I walked to the front and sat behind the microphone. My heart was steady, but my hands were damp. The oath felt heavier than I expected, and the courtroom grew even quieter as I adjusted the microphone and waited for James to begin. He started with questions I had rehearsed in my mind a dozen times. He asked me about the day of the yard sale. I told the court what happened, from Karen's arrival to the fine I received. I explained that I had consulted the HOA handbook, found no amendment, and had requested proof, which was never provided. I talked about how that moment led to conversations with neighbors, how we began comparing violations, how patterns emerged that couldn't be ignored. James moved carefully through the timeline. He brought out emails I had sent and received, violation notices, printouts of the bylaws, and flyers that had circulated. Each time he asked me to confirm the contents. He didn't rush. He built the picture slowly, letting the judge see the pieces fall into place. When Karen's lawyer stood to cross-examine me, his tone was less sharp than I expected. He tried to suggest that I had organized a campaign to discredit Karen. He asked whether I had personal animosity toward her. I told the truth. I said I had never thought about Karen until the day she tried to shut down my yard sale. I said I wasn't angry at her. I was angry at what she had done with the power entrusted to her. He asked if I had encouraged others to ignore HOA rules. I replied that I had encouraged others to ask questions, that I had asked them to stand up for themselves, not to ignore the rules, but to understand them. After that, I stepped down and returned to my seat. Tamika testified next. She was confident, steady, and direct. She brought the folder of her own violations and pointed out how none of them were reviewed by the board. She described her request to see the board meeting minutes and the silence she received in return. Mr. Keating followed her, speaking with a quiet dignity that made even Karen look down at her lap. He described the years he had lived in the neighborhood, the shift he had seen after Karen took control, and the moment he realized the board had become a single voice. The judge listened to every word. When it was Karen's turn to testify, she walked slowly to the witness stand and sat down with deliberate care. Her lawyer began with soft questions. He asked her how long she had served on the board, what responsibilities she carried, and how she saw her role in the community. Karen answered with confidence, describing herself as someone who wanted to protect the neighborhood, who had always tried to maintain order and standards. But when it came time for James to cross-examine her, the tone changed. He asked again about the 2021 amendment. She admitted there was no copy available. He asked whether the vote had taken place. She said she believed it had. When pressed, she admitted she could not name a single board member who had voted with her. When asked whether she had informed residents about the amendment, she claimed the newsletters implied the change. James pulled out copies of the newsletters. He pointed to the absence of any reference to the bylaw. He asked about the landscaping contract. Karen confirmed her cousin's involvement. He asked whether the board had known. She hesitated, then admitted no vote had taken place. The room was silent again. No one moved. The judge looked down, writing notes. When all testimony had concluded, James made a final statement. He said that homeowners trusted the board to act with transparency, fairness, and consistency. He said that power without accountability is dangerous, especially in the quiet places of daily life. He said this case wasn't about one yard sale. It was about what happens when people are silenced by procedure and punished by opinion. Karen's lawyer made his own closing argument, but by then, the room already felt settled. The facts had landed. The judge said he would review the materials and issue a ruling by the following week. We walked out of the courthouse into the late afternoon sun. The sidewalk was warm underfoot, and the air carried the scent of summer approaching. James shook my hand and told me to rest. The hardest part was done. I thanked him, turned the corner, and took the long way back to my car. It felt like breathing after a long swim. Not over yet, but close. Close enough to taste the air again. Close enough to believe in the ending. 3 months passed after the judge handed down his decision. He ruled in our favor, unequivocally, and with little room for interpretation. The fines were deemed invalid, the enforcement practices of the HOA declared procedurally improper, and the financial dealings surrounding the landscaping contract labeled as a conflict of interest that required further internal investigation. Karen was removed from the board and barred from serving in any HOA capacity for a minimum of 5 years. There was no press conference, no dramatic outburst. Just a quiet verdict, mailed in thick envelopes and printed on clean white paper. It was the silence afterward that spoke the loudest. For the first time in years, the neighborhood began to breathe again. The notices stopped appearing in mailboxes. The passive-aggressive emails disappeared from inboxes. The clipboard patrols ceased. It was as if a curtain had finally been lifted, letting sunlight fall on parts of the neighborhood that had long been dimmed by suspicion and fear. Karen moved out quietly. No for sale sign went up, but within weeks her car was gone from the driveway, and a real estate agent was seen entering the house with potential buyers. No one cheered, no one gloated. We had already said what needed to be said in court. We had already done what needed to be done with evidence and persistence. Her leaving was not a victory parade. It was the natural result of a structure finally caving in on itself. The neighborhood changed. It didn't happen all at once, but you could feel it in the way people stood a little taller when walking to their mailboxes. People started to linger on porches again. Small conversations bloomed at the end of driveways. Children played longer in front yards without parents checking over their shoulders. It wasn't just that the rules had changed, it was that the fear had faded. A new board was formed. This time, people showed up to vote. There was a line outside the community center on election day, with neighbors holding coffee cups and chatting like it was a weekend block party. Tamika was elected president. Mr. Keating joined as treasurer. Priya served as secretary. They held open meetings with actual agendas and question time. The minutes were sent out via email and posted online. Budgets were broken down line by line. Nobody minded reading them, because now they meant something. I was asked if I wanted to join the board, but I declined. Not because I didn't care, but because I wanted to return to my life. The yard sale had started as a small act of cleaning up, a simple attempt to let go of the past. I hadn't expected it to become the spark for something so much bigger. I was proud of what we had done, but I was also tired. I needed space to breathe, to rebuild, to rediscover who I was outside of the fight. One morning in late spring, I hosted another yard sale. This time, there were no violations, no arguments, no watchful eyes pretending to be guardians of order, just tables set up under the shade of the big maple tree in my front yard. Boxes filled with things I no longer needed. Books, picture frames, a toaster, 3 pairs of boots that no longer fit. A speaker played soft jazz from my porch, and a table near the edge of the lawn held a pitcher of iced lemonade and cups for anyone who wanted one. People came, not just to buy things, but to talk, to reconnect. Neighbors I had only seen in passing now stopped to chat about their gardens, their kids, their summer plans. Tamika brought over her boys, who raced their scooters up and down the sidewalk. Mr. Keating sat in a lawn chair with a book in his lap and an unspoken smile on his face. Priya brought cookies and a printout of the latest HOA budget, which she handed out with a laugh, saying she couldn't help herself. One woman, new to the neighborhood, stopped by and asked about the history of Oak Heights. I told her the basics, and then I told her what happened with the HOA. She listened quietly, then said it was hard to imagine the place had ever been different. That was the moment I realized how far we had come, how complete the transformation had been. Later that afternoon, a couple came by looking for patio chairs. I offered them a good deal on a matching set, and as they loaded them into their SUV, The woman turned to me and asked if I'd always lived here. I paused before answering, then nodded, because in a way, it felt true. This was my home. This was where I had taken a stand, where I had refused to be quiet, where I had helped others find their voice. The sun hung low in the sky as the day came to a close. I packed up the few items that hadn't sold and stacked the folding tables by the garage. I poured myself the last glass of lemonade and sat on the front step, watching the golden light spill across the street. A breeze moved through the trees, rustling the leaves in a soft, steady rhythm. The mailbox stood quietly at the edge of the lawn, unburdened by threats or warnings. A kid pedaled by on a bike, waving as he passed. The neighborhood had changed. Not because we tore anything down, but because we uncovered what had been hidden, the truth, the right to be heard, the courage to speak. We had challenged the idea that one voice could drown out a community, and we had won. Not with fury, not with spectacle, but with evidence, patience, and solidarity. I took another sip of lemonade and smiled. This time the peace felt real, and it felt earned. The summer came on slowly, like it had been holding its breath. By June, the grass was thick and green again, the kind that made bare feet want to wander. The pool at the community center had reopened with new hours and friendlier staff. The bulletin boards were filled with flyers about block parties, community gardens, and free movie nights on the green. Everything felt a little brighter, not because someone flipped a switch, but because the tension that once hung in the air like fog had finally lifted. I started walking the neighborhood in the mornings again. I used to do it back when I first moved in, before the citations and the clipped warnings and the creeping sense that you were always being watched. The sidewalks were wide and smooth, the kind that encouraged people to wave as they passed. Now, they actually did. A man trimming his hedges would look up and say good morning. A kid waiting for the school bus would smile and ask if I was the one who had the yard sale with the cool old radio. People didn't just live here now, they belonged. One morning, I stopped by Tamika's house. She was sitting on the porch steps, still in her pajamas, sipping coffee from a mug that said, "Boss of everything." We talked for a while, about the upcoming HOA meeting, about her oldest son getting his learner's permit, about the tomatoes in her garden coming in early. It was casual, simple, but underneath it, I felt the quiet bond of everything we'd been through. She didn't need to say it, and neither did I. We had stood up when it mattered, and we'd done it side by side. Later that week, the HOA held its quarterly meeting in the same community center where all of this had begun. But this time, the lights were warm, the chairs arranged in a half circle instead of rigid rows, and there were snacks in the back that hadn't come out of a vending machine. People came not because they were afraid of fines, but because they were curious, interested, involved. Tamika called the meeting to order with a smile and opened the floor to questions right away. One woman asked if they could start a neighborhood newsletter with recipes and stories. A young man suggested putting in a book-sharing box near the playground. An older couple offered to run a monthly game night for anyone who wanted to come. Not every idea was practical, and not all of them were immediately approved, but everyone was heard, and that was the difference. When I got home that night, I sat on the porch and thought about how far things had come. I remembered the first time Karen had walked up my driveway, clipboard in hand, voice cold with authority. I remembered how helpless I had felt reading that fine, how surreal it had been to be punished for something as harmless as a yard sale. At the time, I hadn't known the rules well enough to fight back. I had only known that something didn't feel right. That's where it all began. A feeling, a moment of discomfort I chose not to ignore. Looking back now, it was never about the yard sale. Not really. That was just the trigger, the spark that hit dry grass. The real fire came from something deeper, something I hadn't seen until I started listening to the people around me. When I knocked on doors and asked questions. When I sat at kitchen tables with neighbors who had stayed silent for too long. When I saw the pattern and realized it wasn't mine alone. Karen had counted on silence. She had relied on scattered frustrations and individual fear. What she hadn't counted on was connection, on what happens when people begin to talk, to share, to compare notes. What she didn't see coming was the moment when the community stopped being a collection of separate homes and became a unified voice. It wasn't easy. There were nights I didn't sleep, moments I questioned whether it was worth it. I remember staring at that deposition transcript and wondering if I was in over my head. I remember second-guessing every step, afraid of doing more harm than good. But I kept going, not because I was brave every day, but because I believed in the idea that we deserved better, that no one should feel small in their own home. If there's one thing I learned, it's this: power only works in the dark. It thrives in confusion and isolation. Shine a light on it, speak it out loud, and it begins to shrink. The rules are only as strong as the people who enforce them, and when those people forget who they serve, they can be reminded. Not with shouting, not with fists, but with facts, with process, and with persistence. To anyone reading this, or hearing this, or living something like this, let me say clearly, you are not alone. Your voice matters. Your questions are valid. And if someone tries to use bureaucracy to bully you into silence, you have more tools than you think. Know your rights. Read the fine print. Talk to your neighbors. Document everything. And if you have to fight, do it with clarity and conviction. Because once one person stands up, others will follow. The hardest part is being the first to say, "That's not okay." I didn't set out to be a fighter. I didn't have a grand plan. I had a few folding tables, some things I didn't need anymore, and a quiet hope that maybe someone would stop by and find something useful. In the end, I did sell some stuff, but what I really gained was something I didn't even know I had lost. A sense of belonging, a sense of agency, and a front yard that, for the first time, felt like part of a neighborhood again. So if someone ever tries to flip your table literally or figuratively, don't panic. Take a breath. Stand your ground. Ask questions. And when they try to hand you a fine wrapped in intimidation, wrap it right back in truth. And if the rules are wrong, change them. If the leaders abuse their power, replace them. If the system is broken, fix it. Because this is your home, and you are not a guest here. You are not a burden. You are not out of place. You belong. And the next time someone underestimates you, let them. Smile politely. Then flip the script, the fine, and the whole rule book if you have to. That clipboard isn't heavier than your voice. It never was.